to thank you not only for that introduction, but also for thinking about me and finding a way to get me in front of this really significant group that you've assembled here that is doing terrific work in your region to deal with a variety of issues that can go years unmet unless people step in to do something about them. So, with the obvious and enormous support of then Senator Newman, I'm in awe of what he was able to do to get you $20 million. That's amazing. Actually, that's Herculean in any sense of the world, with so many states cutting budgets and in many cases forgetting the effects that those cuts have on people. For you guys to be able to pull that off, I think is truly remarkable. And then when you think about how you're using the money to not only solve some problems, but also build the capacity of organizations, it's also really terrific, because we know that funding doesn't last forever. But if the organizations are strong, if they have good infrastructure, good bones, so to speak, they're going to continue on to do the work long after that funding goes away. So a lot of kudos to you. Thank you to Sue and also Laura for the work that you're doing and how you also contributed to me getting here. Much of what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to put a slideshow up, so just give me a second. Much of what I'm going to talk about today, some of you are already engaging in, which I'm really happy to see. This is really about making a case for collaboration. And so often we think of collaboration, in a pejorative sense. We think that who wants to collaborate? We already have the answers, but there's so many reasons why I think collaboration is the right thing to do, especially now, that I thought I would basically do this presentation around that notion and try to give you, for those of you who don't necessarily get it, a reason to appreciate why collaborating is such an important thing to do. And I mentioned some of you are doing it. I know that I was really impressed to learn about what Big Brothers and Big Sisters is doing with the police departments, Bigs with Badges. I think that's a really interesting collaboration. And the work that's going on with the 7 Boys and Girls Clubs that hadn't worked together before. These are the kind of collaborations that can generate new value. And we're going to get into some of that today in this conversation. So let me start the presentation off. And by the way, and as Tim said, we'll have some opportunity to ask questions and maybe talk with each other about some of the ideas that I present here. So I hope that you'll post them so that Tim can let me know what you're thinking. But first, let's start with this notion of commoditization. And a lot of times we think about nonprofit work as being very unique. And indeed, nonprofits are unique. Almost every organization does its work in somewhat of a different way. But we're not immune to many of the forces that are driving commoditization in the business sector. And there was a study done some years ago by the Boston Consulting Group. And they indicated that the time that a company had to lead an industry, in other words, the company that had the highest market share in an industry and kept that lead, went from 4 years to 2 years in about a 20-year stretch. And that was back in 2014. So it's probably, I would imagine, less than 2 years now that a company leading an industry in terms of market share would remain in that position. And that obviously has great implications for how we must think about change and innovation, of course, but charities are not, as I mentioned, immune to that. It's happening to us too, because in many ways, our organizations are not the sole arbiters anymore of mission-based work. So let's talk about some of that. First of all, in our own sector, we know that the number of organizations continues to grow. And if you look at these numbers here on the right, you'll see that for the last 5 years, there's been at least 83,000 new organizations created every year for the last 5 years. At least 83,000, almost 84,000 organizations. These organizations are stepping in to try to do a lot of the work that those pre-existing organizations are doing. And in our country, we've always made it easy relatively for groups to form and provide some form of social good. Well, you can imagine the impact that that's having on fundraising, the impact that that's having on how donors go about selecting which organizations to support, and the pressure that is putting on organizations to perform in a way that's special and unique to somehow differentiate themselves in this marketplace. So this is one big factor that I think is really driving organizations to change and have to be better than they were before. There's no time or place for complacency with this many organizations coming into our sector. And by the way, we are seeing some growth in the amount of funding, at least coming from private sources, slight growth, maybe 2 to 3% a year. But when you look at the number of new organizations, it in no way keeps pace with those numbers. So something to think about. Also, in addition to traditional charitable organizations, 501c3 organizations, I suspect most of you are 501c3s, there's also been created recently a number of hybrid forms of charitable-like organizations. These are businesses with sort of a nonprofit orientation as well. And while they're still not, hundreds of thousands of them, they are growing and they are competing for the attention of donors as well as investors who may have decided, well, rather than support a nonprofit organization, maybe we'll support one of these hybrids. And who knows, we might even get a return on our investment in addition to creating some social good. This is, something that nonprofits, again, have to think about when they're designing their programs. There are these maybe much better funded organizations that are coming through these other hybrid forms. There are also social movements that we see and many of us have experienced. These are, in many cases, not organizations at all. They're not, in a sense, formal corporations that are out there doing this work. These are people who have banded together in some unincorporated way to drive change. And while in years past, you might want to set up a formal organization to do that, and people are still doing that, these social movements, which are driven by social media, and they're able to bring mass groups of people together, not only to protest, so to speak, but also to push for change in ways that are not so visible. And I think we all have to be mindful of this as we go about doing our work, that a lot of good is being done, and maybe some not so good, depending on how you look at it, by entities that are not even charitable. And from a donor standpoint, you begin to ask yourself, is it better for me to put my time and energy into a social movement than to put it into an organization? There are also what I call technological solutions that help drive social good. I put two here for you to see. One is called Patreon. I don't know if many of you have heard of Patreon, but it enables everyday people to support artists who are up and coming or who are already coming, so that they can focus on their art and not worry about funding so much. In the past, we would have created institutions to try to support artists. But here we have basically an app that people can sign on to if you're an artist of any kind, and try to get people to support your work. You don't have to be a corporation anymore. You can just be an individual out there doing your art, and you can generate support through an application that everyone can download on their phone or computer. If you want to, you can donate on a regular basis or episodically to any one of hundreds and maybe thousands of musicians, artists, video creators, etc., who are doing this work. And I know you're working on poverty in this region as well. And there's this group called Hand Up that I came across that is also helping to deal with poverty and homelessness by giving people opportunities to sign on to an app, support a particular homeless person or an organization if you choose, and they will make sure that those funds get where they were directed. So these are other, I would say, new entrants into the social good space. And we all are aware of the tremendous impact that corporate social engagement has had on our work in the nonprofit sector. Sometimes in partnership with charitable organizations, but other times not. Companies are stepping up, brands are stepping up in different ways to provide social good, because they realize that in order to generate customer loyalty, and maybe even to attract employees who are looking for companies that are standing up for good, they have to act in this way, because without it, they won't get the talent or the loyalty from their customers that they need to thrive. So just imagine, my daughter happens to work for Goldman Sachs, and she works in their foundation. And I kid her a lot about Goldman Sachs, but the truth is that Goldman has invested more than $500 million into supporting small businesses. And there's not a whole lot that they get back from that, other than the goodwill from having to, from being recognized for supporting our nation's small business. And what's so interesting about this particular program is that they run it entirely in-house. Years ago, a company like this might say, let's make a grant to some nonprofits that are doing work for small businesses, that are helping small businesses get started. And we will maybe take some credit for making that grant. But today, they're actually running this program in-house. And yes, they've hired some vendors to support them, but it's largely owned, it's entirely owned by Goldman Sachs Foundation. So this is something new. I mean, in the days gone by when I was doing job training work, we would never see a company stepping out there like this, taking on an enterprise like this. They would always work with one of our partners or in the job training space. So again, the whole point here is that in addition to us nonprofits, being the good doers, so to speak, we're being challenged, I think, with new forms of, if you want to say, competition, that are also stepping up to the plate to provide social good. And I guess we can't say that's a bad thing, but we also have to recognize that it is forcing us to be stronger, to be more effective, and to look for ways to do our work better and differently than we have in the past. All of this means that as nonprofit organizations, we have to be more innovative, and we have to look for ways constantly to generate new value. What we used to do in the past is fine, but it's also important that our work be relevant for what's coming down the road. And how do we do that when, as I mentioned before, nonprofits are constantly under-resourced? We never have enough money, it seems, to do the work that we want to do. So where does this resource come from to get us what we need to innovate? I mean, most of us spend the entire day thinking about how are we going to make it through the next month. Nonprofits generally don't have enough money to get through the month, more or less thinking about what happens down the road. We're fortunate if we have enough in our bank accounts to make payroll over the next 3 months. And if there's any kind of serious disruption, a lot of us may even have to go dormant, or we would be, struggling to figure out, how we made it. So who has time to think about 3 years, 5 years from now? Where do we get the resource to do that? And that's what we have to begin thinking about. How do we generate new value, given that our focus most of the time is on today rather than what comes next? And as you know, one solution people like to talk about is collaboration. Well, one way for us to do it would be, let's figure out how we can collaborate with others, and then we can get maybe some time to do something else, right? Something better. But we know as organizations that there are some serious barriers to collaboration. Mainly because of our orientation, toward collaboration. We like to think of collaboration, but we also know that a lot of times organizations that are collaborating are troubled to begin with. When we see mergers, for instance, they're usually two organizations, or at least one of them, that were in trouble. And so people say, let's throw them together and see what happens, we have this win-lose mentality when we do come to the table. We think more about what can we get even if the other party doesn't get anything. We're trying to think about how our organization can win, even if that means our collaborator loses. Other collaborations are, kind of driven by funders, and they're not really part of what a charity would have done. But since the money is out there, well, we'll collaborate, just to take advantage of that funding. But we really don't want to work together. I have to admit, being part of one of these years ago, we were doing our work in job training, and a funder came along with not a whole lot of money either, by the way, and said, we'd like you to collaborate with another organization. And the reason they were doing that was they were looking for ways to reduce their own grant portfolio. And so they said, if we make one grant to the two of you, then we can save money in an environment where we're looking to cut the amount of funding that we're giving out. So we took the money, obviously, but we weren't highly motivated to work together. And so these aren't necessarily collaborations that charities want to engage in. Another I call is hubris. We don't want to collaborate with people because they don't know the answer. We know the answer. And why should we be wasting time with people who don't know how to do this work? We know how to do the work. We just need the money to do it. Leave us alone. Let us go. And then there's also this, I think, focus sometimes that we have on our organization more than the mission. Meaning sometimes we think about, well, what will it take to keep our organization going, even if a collaboration could have better helped us achieve our mission. So, if the collaboration might hurt the organization but help the mission, we might opt to not do it because we think it's too damaging to our organization, and we'll find another way later on to worry about the mission. So all of these are what I consider to be serious barriers that we have to acknowledge when we think about collaborating. They are certainly, if someone tells you they want to merge, I mean, the people in your organization aren't going to be thinking about how this is going to benefit them. I mean, if you're an employee in an organization that's about to merge, you're probably thinking you're going to lose your job, or at least some people are going to lose their jobs if we merge, right? Because we don't need two accountants. We don't need, two people running a program. We can do it with less people. And so the energy inside of a merged organization is not going to be positive. There's going to be a lot of resistance around that. So all of these, as I mentioned, are serious barriers to cooperation and keep us, I think, thinking that if there's an opportunity to collaborate, maybe we'll pass. But there's some other forces in the world now that I think are driving us to think differently about collaboration. First of all, we should think about young people and how they think and operate. These digital natives, if you want to call them that, are young people who are raised with technology. They have not known a world where they didn't have phones and tablets and computers and gadgets. They play as much outdoors and in person with people as they do on their devices. And they learn on their devices. And so for them, it's more natural for them to potentially collaborate with other people because that's how they play. There are, I'm told, these platforms where kids can go and participate in not only learning how to play video games, but actually playing video games with people all over the world. It's much more natural for them to engage this way. And if we can think about the world 5 to 10 years from now, when these tools will become even more immersive and engaging, we can imagine that it will be even easier for them to collaborate. And we can just think about ourselves. We're here together now because of technology, basically. This would not have worked if we were going to do it by phone. And this ability that we're having right now to collaborate, to work together on this particular presentation is something that we can expect to have, I think, even more of in the future. So the tools are going to make it easier for us to work together and collaborate. Then there is this notion of what Marina Gorbis from the Institute for the Future calls social structing. And social structing is this idea that it's very easy now to find people who are interested in working on something that you're working on, either through social networks or the Internet of Things. We can find collaborators much more easily now than we could in the past. Just think about organizations like Fiverr that make it so easy to find people who can do specific services or skills for us at a relatively inexpensive cost. And people who can band together with us who are interested in a particular mission, as I mentioned, through a lot of the social networks that we're seeing. So we're much more, I think, oriented now to building organizations and institutions through these tools that enable us to find and collaborate with people. Thirdly is this notion of gainful engagement. Gainful engagement is this ability for us to work in immersive environments, but to do so in an experimental way. So we can take the risk out of failure when we do something in a gamed format. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily every video game, but certainly there's much more of an orientation now to game out things, to think through, well, I wonder if we tried this thing in a simulated way, whether or not it could work. And we can imagine that in time, the tools for simulated experiments and collaborations that take the risk out of potentially failing will, I think, tremendously speed up the number and, I think, forcefulness of collaborating and working together in the future. And of course, there's this notion of big data, which is probably overstated, maybe in some cases, but there's a reality that algorithms are driving us closer together in many ways, and they're certainly boxing us off too. There's been some talk about how we can all be placed in filter bubbles based on our preferences. But our preferences also drive us to better appreciate and connect with people. And I think the future and even the present has made it a lot easier for us to connect because of our preferences. So there are lots of ways for people to find each other, to collaborate, and to imagine a world in which it's much easier to work together at lower cost than ever before. And if we can be successful, then we can defeat some of these concerns that I mentioned earlier that are driving significant commoditization of our sector and of social good in general. So we need to think about these forces that are enabling collaboration to occur. In order to do this, though, we have to begin thinking about a new paradigm. And maybe after this slide, we'll take some questions if there are any. But for so long, I believe many in our sector, for good reason, have thought about operating from a position of scarcity. We just don't have enough to do everything we want. And so we tend to limit what we set out to do based on what we have. And we don't imagine what we could be doing by working together with others because we're focused on protecting what we have rather than actually solving a problem. And what we might want to begin thinking about is a new paradigm where we operate it from abundance. What if, as a sector, instead of worrying about holding on to what we had, we began thinking about operating
Tim?
I think we may have just lost Art.
Okay.
And I am ill-equipped to give the rest of his presentation. Why don't we give him a second? This has happened to me as well. I sometimes get a little note that my internet connection is unstable. It may have been with you all the last presentation that we did where I got booted off about 4 times.
That was with us, Tim.
Yeah. So yeah, let's just give him a second. Let me see if I can email him and
I think while we're waiting for Art to come back, I'm going to put a link to the evaluation form on the comments box right here for those of you guys who want to get it opened up.
So I've just emailed Art. So if y'all can just sit tight for a second, let's just, this is the fun of technology.
He's back.
Great. All
Sorry
right.
about that.
Well, Art, I was tap dancing while you were gone. I was entertaining everybody with a little soft shoe. So hope everybody enjoyed that. But
sorry about
that's all right. We've had this happen. The last workshop we did that I did, I got booted off 4 times because my internet was going in and out. So we're glad you're back. So we'll let you go ahead, and I hope that Laura, does he still co-hosting?
Yeah, you have to get me back to that, and I can get back on. But we were at a point anyway where I wanted to begin seeing what people's thoughts were about the whole notion of commoditization and any other questions they may have had before we actually get into some of the conversation around considerations for organizations that actually want to collaborate. So I'm happy to begin taking some questions.
So I don't see any questions in the chat. However, I would say right now, since there are no questions in the chat, if there's anybody that has a question, if you want to take yourself off mute real quick and just ask that question, go ahead.
Okay, so we'll continue, and I'm sure some things will come up as we continue to do this. But my point here was that we need to begin thinking about abundance as a sector. We need to begin imagining a world in which things are possible. And with technology and our ability to connect and our ability to work more seamlessly across geographies and ideologies for that matter, we have a lot of new opportunities to get together to accomplish things that we might never have some years ago. And that to me is a whole new resource that we never thought about before. Part of this new paradigm is to think about what Bob Johansen and Carl Rohn, who are authors of a book called Reciprocity Advantage, what they've come up with. And in their mind, there are business transactions which we're all familiar with. Transactions wherein I give you something and you give me something in return, and we're both happy. We both get to, so to speak, get what we want. But also in business transactions, a lot of times value is negotiated. So I'm going to try in a business transaction to make sure, if possible, I get more than what I expected. And you're going to do the same thing. Hopefully, you know, everyone's happy at the end. But going into that transaction, we're not thinking about anything else but what we're going to get from that. In a charity transaction, we're thinking about what we can do, but we're not thinking about getting anything necessarily in return. In that situation, we're wanting to make sure that hopefully what we gave away is put to some good use, but there's not any expectation that we're going to get anything in return. But in a reciprocal transaction or transaction involving reciprocity, we are essentially giving something away wisely, in hopes that it will be put to good use and that maybe we will get something in return. There's no guarantee that we're going to get something in return, but we're thinking that if we choose the right partners to share something with, then we are going to get something back for it. And as organizations, what that involves are some of the things that I'm going to talk about, but the main thing is understanding what it is that you want to achieve, what assets you have that you might be willing to share. These are assets either that you have in great abundance and you can share them, or they're assets that are underutilized. And if you find the right partner, those assets might be better utilized than you just sitting on them. And by doing that, by sharing these assets, there's no pressure on your organization because you weren't doing much with them anyway. A collaboration based on a reciprocity advantage, I think, are the kinds of collaborations that also take us away from some of those negative impetuses or negatives that I think keep us from wanting to collaborate. So I want to begin want us to begin thinking about this new paradigm of reciprocity. And by the way, a lot of the 9 considerations that I'm going to be talking about, you will feel, I believe, embedded into this notion of reciprocity. So what are some of the 9 considerations? Let's talk about them a bit. Obviously, the first one is to build trust, because no one will want to work with you, and obviously you won't want to work with someone else if you don't trust them. And we realize that trust is not something that we get right away. It takes time to build trust. It takes maybe working at a smaller scale necessarily. It may even take some legal formatting to make sure that we can operate in a trustless way. But the notion is here that there's very little opportunity for people to work together without building trust. And so some ways you can go about building trust as an organization is to exercise great governance, manage your organization's finances well, and report those finances in a transparent way. Be truthful about your communications. Look for ways to demonstrate that your organization is trustworthy, so that you will be, in my opinion, worthy in a way of others wanting to work with you. And you should seek the same from others, so that when you enter into these relationships, you're not feeling that you can't go all out in making sure that they succeed. The next one really has to do with having a vision. And when I say have a vision, I mean, think down the road a little bit. It's harder to collaborate on things that are happening right now, mainly because organizations will already have thought through how they want to operate, what they want to do. And if you're not collaborating with them currently, it's unlikely that they're going to stop what they're doing just to find a way to work with you on something that's happening now. But if you can think a few years down the road, because of a vision that you have to create something that doesn't currently exist, you're going to have a much better chance, I think, of building a collaboration. Let's imagine that we all have a sense that in 5 years' time, we can reduce homelessness by 50%. We haven't currently figured out how to do that, but we want to work together to figure out what assets do we have, who are the best people to work with, what ideas should we even try to experiment with to get to that place, to get to that outcome. What assets do we have and what assets do we need that might create the success of this program? These are all things that any organization might want to participate in, because it doesn't mean that you're losing anything today. You're trying to build something down the road so you have more freedom to engage without feeling any particular loss today. This is why I say have a vision. And by the way, as I mentioned before, given the pace of change and the reality that what you're doing today is probably not going to be relevant 5 years from now, there is an impetus to think longer range, to make sure that you have I would say, toolkit of future programs and opportunities to serve that need to be created that haven't been yet. So you need to begin thinking about who your collaborators are well in advance of a time when your particular programs will cease to be to function well and to serve a need. So having a vision is really important, and obviously there's some strategic planning that goes into that. There's a great deal of work on the part of your boards and senior staff to develop that, feedback from your constituents, and an understanding of what's going on in your environment so that you can get these programs going. One last point I want to make about this. Some people will argue, Art, you've got to be kidding me. Southern California is actually on fire right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and our organizations are struggling mightily. And you're asking us to think 5 to 7 years down the road. Are you nuts? I completely get that. But think of this. Think of this. It may be easier to think 5 to 7 years down the road and imagine what the world will be then than it is to think 6 months down the road or even a year down the road. You can have a clearer vision if you were to look further out than you can sometimes just looking in a much more constrained time period. Things are very messy right now, very unclear. There's not a whole lot of clarity in our world right now. Lots of disruption and uncertainty. So it may be easier. I'm just asking you to think about it in your own organizational context, to think longer term. And in any event, organizations that think longer term, I believe, bring a lot more hope and optimism to what they're doing, particularly when you're in the middle of a crisis. So just something to think about there. There's this idea that I think is so central to creating a new paradigm for collaborating. And it's this idea that we seek to assure the success of our collaborator or collaborators, depending on how many we have. So imagine that you enter into a partnership. And as I said before, our orientation is always to make sure that our organization gets the most out of this. That's just how we're trained. We're competitive people. And, you know, if there's a way for us to get the most, then we're going to get the most. And if that means that the other partner suffers, then so be it. They should know better, and, you know, they should be looking out for themselves. It's not our responsibility. But when you're trying to create new value, something that doesn't exist, and you realize that it's probably going to be difficult for you to create this new value alone, you not only need to be successful, but your collaborator has to be successful. And remembering, you have identified some resources that maybe you can afford to lose, right? You can afford to lose these resources to accomplish this greater goal. So what you really want to do to make sure this collaboration works is your collaborator has to actually be successful. And that may mean at different points during the project or during the collaboration where you sit down and assess what's going on, and you say to each other, how are you doing? Is there something else that you need that is maybe slowing down your ability to produce or interfering with, you know, your progress? What can we do to help with that? You're also going to find that collaborations can be very asymmetrical. There may be one organization that has a lot more to bring to the table than another, but the piece that organization is bringing is really important. So, you know, it could be big and small organizations in the sector, outside the sector. we have to think differently about who our collaborators are. And sometimes they're going to be asymmetrical, and they're going to need different kinds of support in order to assure their own success so that the collaboration can succeed. And again, I realize this may be counterintuitive to some, because our orientation is always, let's make sure that we get the most out of something. But what I'm thinking of is a different paradigm where we're looking for ways for everyone to succeed, because that's the only way we're going to create this new value. And then there's this notion of failing fast, building rigorous feedback loops. So when we engage in a collaboration, let's have some clearly defined goals. When are things going to happen? Who's responsible? If people aren't succeeding, let's, evaluate the situation. Is it because of a problem that I just mentioned? Maybe they need some assistance, and once they get that assistance, then we can succeed with the project. Or is there something bigger going on? Maybe in this case, we didn't pick the right partner. And if not, then we need to evaluate that. And if it's not working, let's not, so to speak, make this more painful than it needs to be. Let's find a way to pull out of it. Let's get out of it. Every collaboration isn't going to work. And it doesn't mean that we failed. It just means that that one didn't work. And you'll see when we get to some of these other principles that I'm going to lay out, that that's okay, because we need to have a portfolio of these anyway in order to assure that we actually can get some that actually work. Taking stock really goes to the conversation we were having a bit ago about sharing what you have with hopes of getting something in return, but certainly not expecting, at least thinking that you're going to be guaranteed to get something in return. You're going to have to take time and look at your organization and consider what strengths and weaknesses you have. Are there things that you could do, but you need another organization to bolster you to do? Alternatively, are there things that you could bolster another organization with, given your abilities? You're really going to have to take time organizationally to think about what those things are. They could be programs that you've executed well. They could be facilities that you have that are underutilized. It could be a connection to a grantor that wants to do something that you're not 100% able to do. It could be a talent that you have existing in your organization. Just imagine having a person who's really good at, let's say, graphic design, and another organization could use that graphic design. Or maybe you could collaborate around the use of that graphic designer. I'm just throwing that out. I mean, there's any number of talents, skills, abilities, resources that you may have in your organization that either you're strong or not so strong at, that you're willing to share or you're going to need from someone else. That's what I mean by taking stock. And when you find out what these things are, you have a better idea of who you should be collaborating with. And as I mentioned, taking a portfolio approach is really important here too. Not every collaboration is going to succeed. And it really doesn't have to, because what we're thinking about here are things that have never been done before, and we're trying to generate new value. These programs that I'm suggesting to you, if they fail, should not put your organization in crisis. It's really important to understand that. You're putting a piece of the puzzle out there, and you're trying to find others who have pieces of this puzzle to create this new value. But by sharing that piece, it should not put your organization in crisis if you don't get that piece back. And so you can put a piece with one or several of these collaborations in hopes that if you manage them well, some will work. And that is how, in my opinion, you can take advantage of what other larger corporations are doing to create new value, or to take advantage of their position and keep their position strong in an environment that is hyper change. You have to do lots of these. It's not simply one or two, it's lots. And you have to build into your organizational culture an orientation around working with others. That takes sort of a skill set in and of itself, to hire people who are more empathetic, who are open to hearing ideas from others, who are good at sharing, who are good at project managing. There's a skill set that I think that is associated with great collaborators. And I think organizations have to consider that as well. You have to think about your boards. You know, are your boards really open to working with other organizations? And if not, then that's a discussion I think you need to have at the board level to help your board understand what it is that you're trying to achieve by working with others. As I mentioned, there's so many new entrants into the social good space that don't think that your only partners can be charities. I know lots of organizations are collaborating with corporations. Think about for-profit startups and social networks and other means, maybe some individuals who are doing good things as sole proprietors who you might be able to collaborate with to create new value. Particularly, you know, you want to assess, I guess, whether their hearts are, so to speak, in the right place. I mean, whether your values align. But if they do, what difference does it make that they're not a nonprofit? I mean, the goal here should be to create new value that can serve your mission. And so it doesn't matter, shouldn't matter what their form is. If you're looking for a partner, consider non-traditional ones, and you might find that there's some great opportunity there as well. And then there's the importance of keeping your funders appraised. So often, I think, we forget to let our funders know that, guess what? We're doing this great collaboration. Maybe you might want to support this. Or come to the funder with an idea rather than waiting for the funder to put something out to you. So if you can get together with 3 or 4 organizations, come up with a great idea, how powerful is it to go to a funder and stretch them to support you in a way that brings new value to your community or to the mission that you're thinking about? So it's important to keep them appraised. And I know lots of funders want to support collaborations because it leverages their resources in ways that they haven't thought about before. So that's most of the presentation. I mean, starting small is obviously an important thing because you can keep your risks down, and it gives you a chance to consider whether your partners are trustworthy. You can start with, you know, some short-term projects to test out your ability to work together and learn and build confidence. So starting small is a great way to think about collaborating. So that's it. I'm going to take it off share and see if we can have, Tim, a bit of a conversation about, you know, some of these concepts, and just kind of see where some organizations are. I'm really curious of whether or not any of the organizations are doing any of these things, and whether or not you've seen success or not in attempting to do some of them.
Great. Okay, so actually there's a question. I'm going to so I'm going to actually call on Keith. I'm going to let you, if you can take yourself off mute for a second, and because I think this dovetails right with what Art was just saying. And you had a question about something that's going on currently with you. So Keith, why don't you ask that question? If you're there. Are you there? Still there, Keith? Are you on mute?
Keith says he's here. Maybe can he take himself off mute is the question. He's using a phone for audio.
Oh, so, okay. So I'll ask Keith's question. I won't do it justice because Keith is very erudite, but I will give it my best shot. Okay. So Keith says he's in the process of reviewing grant proposals for a major national project promoting equity. And it seems that many well-known organizations don't actually know what it means to collaborate in any meaningful way. If an organization is training community advocates, as an example, there's probably someone else who can provide some sort of expertise to maximize the effectiveness of the training project. Since he's in this review process, he's asking, how do I communicate in a constructive way that collaboration does not seem like something the organization is thinking of, but needs to be more, but needs for a more persuasive proposal? So let me broaden that out for you a little bit, Art, because this was a question I wanted to ask you too, because you mentioned keeping funders appraised. Yeah. And you know a lot of funders, people who are funding in this space. And one of the things we were going to do at the symposium was have a funders panel where we actually brought some of them to talk about their perspectives on collaboration. But perhaps you can maybe jump off Keith's question and talk a little bit about the donor and particularly foundations and grantors, you know, their perspective on foundation and what they really want to see in proposals around collaboration.
Well, sure. Listen, let me start out by saying I've never had the honor of being a grant maker. So you can take some of what I say, I guess, with a grain of salt. But I do know this. Funders want their grants to be successful. They want to see outcomes achieved. And they also like to leverage their funding so that it can go further than it might if they don't leverage it. And if I were in their position, I would be thinking, my goodness, I've just had 4 organizations come to me and they want to work together to accomplish something meaningful in our community around an area that we issue grants. I would think that that funder would have to take this seriously. Doesn't mean that they're always going to fund it, but it would seem to me that if 4, significant organizations or even 2 in a particular community come together with an idea, that funder would have to give that some serious consideration. And you might get more consideration doing it that way than you would going in alone. Now, I realize that for some, this might feel risky, because if you have a grant with a foundation already and you want to keep that grant, you might realize that, oh, if I bring someone in, it might affect what our organization gets in the future. But it might not. It might also be that the funder is saying, we're going to continue to fund you, but we think this thing that you're doing is so important that we're going to fund it as well. And that's what we're trying to get to. I think what's important, though, is that you show them that this is truly a partnership, that all players in the mix have a role to play, and that you have some really, I think, innovative ideas for how to accomplish something that hasn't been achieved before, or how to avoid something that could be devastating in many ways to a community. And it doesn't take a whole lot to convince people of that, certainly nowadays.
Yeah, Keith, I also think that you, to specific to your question, in the process you're involved in right now, you might want to jump off of Art's 9 considerations. and maybe providing some feedback to the organizations that are claiming to be strong collaboratives, but they're not really adhering to the principles that are set out in those 9 considerations, and that you might recommend that they do that. I'll tell you, I have been a grant maker, and I, currently serve on a countywide board that does grants, and I was just a reviewer of proposals, and there was one proposal that seemed like a decent concept, but it was rejected on the basis, it was a collaborative, but it was rejected on the basis that the collaborative was not clearly defined. If I look at ART's 9 considerations, they probably failed on 6 of them, and that there was no clear sense that there was any sort of agreement between the collaborating partners. And so that worries you as a funder, because you're going, well, what happens if there's a personality conflict 2 months into this thing and we've just allocated $500,000 for them to, do something together and it blows up, So I think having things like memorandums of understanding, partnership agreements, things like that, that sort of codify and make the collaboration not just this thing that we're sort of voluntarily participating in when it feels okay to us, but it's something that we've committed to all be a part of. And as Art said, sort of take a piece of our organization and lend that asset to the collaborative for more of a mission focus rather than an organization specific focus. Let me jump back up. Adriana had a question. I think it was related to one of the early slides that you showed, Art.
Sure.
And I think it's very interesting. Do you have any idea, because you showed that slide about how many nonprofits there are and sort of setting the stage for this competitive environment that exists out there for dollars but do you have any idea how many organizations are operating under fiscal sponsorship that haven't necessarily formed a 501c3? It's a practice for a lot of small organizations to try to have minimal or overhead costs, but that's not factored into that big number, is it?
It's not. And, so, but I'm happy that they're operating maybe under that guise, because that does reduce, some of the inefficiencies. Why do they need accountants and so forth? But the bottom line is there are more organizations, and that's all I'm really trying to highlight here. And so we have to keep up. And, in nonprofits, it's easy to think, again, like businesses, which is the best way to go is just to kill the competition. And then if you can kill the competition, then, you'll succeed. But is that really how we should be thinking? I tell our people all the time, if there's another organization that comes along and does work better than us, more power to them. Because ultimately what I want is for people to make informed giving decisions. That's why I do what I do. And if there are others that can come along and do that, hopefully some collaboratively, maybe, or not collaboratively, if they can drive that objective, they should be allowed to do that. I shouldn't be trying to put them out of business. I should be trying to help them.
Right.
So, it's all about what is our focus? Is it on solving the problem or achieving the mission, or it is on sustaining our organization? That's really hard. It's hard to get there. But I think if we're really going to operate as a sector that accomplishes objectives, we have to begin thinking more that way. And that doesn't mean we don't think at all about competition or we give everything away, because some things aren't ready to be shared, right? We have to make sure that the thing actually works before we're giving it away. But in the end, I think it has to be mission that drives us more than sustaining our organizations. And that's hard. That's hard for people to hear. But if you're going to be a great collaborator, I think that's kind of where your mindset has to be.
All right, I love also, let me jump back to the funder question for a second, because I think a lot of this stuff people think about, the funding for it. And I love what you said about not being passive with funders about that perhaps, and I think nonprofits, the organizations, we tend to sort of think of funders like we're supplicants, we're knee walking into them, give us money, give me that $25,000 grant, that $50,000 grant, when we're the ones actually out here making the impact. And their job performance is based on funding that impact, right? And if that's not happening, if they're not making the best decisions about the allocation of their money, and that we can maybe advocate for better grant making by coming to them and pushing them to think differently, by collaborating more effectively. I really love that concept. And I don't think that the service providing nonprofit community understands maybe the power that they might have in doing that if they collaborated more effectively.
I agree. And it's going to be a lot harder to get through a foundation's doors by yourself.
Right.
That's just a reality.
Yeah.
But if you can come in as a group, it's hard to turn that down. It's just hard to, so that's why, I sort of encourage people to think that way.
Yeah. So let me ask another question that was in the chat. Going back to building rigorous feedback loops, can you expound a little bit more on best practices in building vigorous feedback loops, especially in an atmosphere where you may be doing something that's really new and there may be a possibility that it will fail fast? How do you build those rigorous feedback loops?
So think about it this way. You've established a project that you want to work on with a couple of other organizations. Each organization has sat down and decided what they bring to the table, and they've committed that to this collaboration. So what's important now, I think, is that you manage that, meaning that there needs to be periodic times where you all get together and you check in and you ask, where are we in the collaboration? Last time we got together, Art, you said that you were going to discuss this internally with your team and identify 4 participants who could give us some insight. Tim, you said you were going to begin discussing this with a funder because you had a relationship that you thought with a funder that was going to be meaningful to making this happen. And maybe the third person, let's say Laura, basically says, I have this program design that I think could work, and I'm going to have that ready when we get together, okay? So when we get together, lo and behold, Art hasn't done what he said he was going to do. Okay, Art, what's going on? Why, are you serious about this? Do you really want this to work? We really need you to do this. So there's a number of things that can happen next. The first thing is Art says, it was just a bad week. I promise I'll have it. So let's plan to get together again in next week, and I'll have it done. We get together next week. Art has it done. We're good. If we get together next week and Art doesn't have it done, then we need to ask Art, is there something we can do to help you? Because we can't do this collaboration unless you're successful. Art might say, well, I really could use, some help of somebody who knows how to, talk to a certain type of individual, because I'm having some trouble getting some of my staff to do that. Fine. Laura says, I have somebody on my team. We can do that. Laura sends that person, and lo and behold, we get what we need. Now, if 3 weeks down the road, we have another meeting and Art hasn't done what he's asked to do, now we're starting to question whether Art's really in this thing. And it's that kind of feedback that is going to help us determine if A, we can do the collaboration without Art, or B, we need to end the collaboration altogether, or C, we need to identify someone else because Art isn't necessarily getting it done. So that's what I mean. We have to develop feedback among the collaborators so that we know that we're driving success. Now, there's other types of feedback too that go beyond the collaboration. I'm talking there about inside of any organization. If you're doing a program with various constituents, you want to get feedback from your constituents. And there's a great organization out there that's doing good work on that called Feedback Labs that you might want to talk with about that. But in general, what I'm talking about is building feedback among the collaborators so that you know the progress is being made.
I think also, I Sue put something in the chat that I think is true. This relies, and you said it earlier, Art, I'm glad you mentioned it, that good collaborators are good project managers, right? And this is a skill that you need to teach your people in your organization how to manage projects, because project management is built on expectations, right? Mm-hmm. And if it's hard to put a genie back in the bottle. I've been involved in collaborations almost exactly the way Art just described, where there was one person, they were supposed to do this one thing and it was an important part of it, but every single time we had our part of the feedback loop, we're like, it can't move forward unless this person does this one thing. But I will tell you that in that instance, I learned a lesson, because that was early on in my career. I learned a lesson that we had not established clear expectations at the beginning of what everybody's role was, who was responsible, who was accountable, who's consulted, who's informed on each of the deliverables and each of the milestones that we all want to achieve together. And then also clarity around the expectations of the time commitments of everybody, because that can cause frictions too. If Christine is part of a collaborative that where she's spending of her 40-hour work week, she's spending 20 of her hours, and the other people are all spending 5 of theirs, then that can cause friction, if it's supposed to be a shared responsibility. So I think it's very important to do really good project managing and also set expectations up top, so you're not putting a genie back in the bottle. Instead you're starting from a good place. It makes it easier to solve problems later.
Absolutely.
So let's see. You mentioned skill sets, and one of the skill sets or the traits that you want to find in a good collaborator is empathy, which I think is really great. It really dovetails with your concept of being more mission focused rather than just organization focused on things, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the other skill sets that we should be looking for when considering who we should be collaborating with?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's different than what we might normally seek in a person, right? So one of them is, and I think we need this in general in our sector, is what I would call initiative. Mm-hmm. Because inside of an organization, there are ideas that always go untapped. And sometimes that's because people who have those ideas don't take initiative. Now, that also means that leaders in organizations have to operate in a way that they believe in their people's ideas, and that they don't see themselves as the sole arbiter of our ideas. If you're the person in your organization who believes nothing happens unless it's my idea, you're going to stifle the kind of creativity that you need to succeed. And it's really important that you distribute ownership for new ideas throughout the organization. Really important. Because, as I said before, you want a portfolio of things. And unless you as the leader want to do it all yourself, you need to get people bought into this. One way to get people bought in is to tell them, if you have an idea, bring it to me and let's see if we can't do it. As an employee, I'm loving that, because now I have ownership over something in the organization. And I can tell you from my own organization's case, when we did that, not only were people willing to do their own job, what we actually hired them to do, they were willing to try this new thing too, and lead this new thing. And so one is, you got to have people who understand that they own the organization in a way, and it's their responsibility to come up with new ideas. And if they do, they're going to get supported in executing those new ideas. But it's also, as a leader, I think your responsibility, I think you should have an orientation toward letting people try things. And, people also have to be accustomed with failure. Failure is not a bad word. It's the opposite. It's not necessarily the opposite of success to me. It's in line with success.
Right.
It's in line with success, because you can't do things that have never been done before without some degree of setback. And so you need people who are resilient, people who won't crumble just because the thing that they tried the first time didn't work. You're going to have to keep going back to the drawing board. That's how we find new value. That's how we get to the mission objective that we set for ourselves. By trying, getting a setback, overcoming it, trying again, succeeding, getting another setback, trying it. It's like the stock market. It goes like this. But ultimately, you're getting there because you're learning along the way. The third is you have to have people who are willing to learn. Some people just don't want to learn anything new. If you don't want to learn anything new, you shouldn't be working in nonprofits.
Amen.
Because there's no time for that. There's no room for that.
Yeah.
Things that we used to do don't apply anymore. And there's always something different happening, so that if we are willing to learn, we can grow as an organization. I bet most people here never heard of Zoom before last year, probably.
Right.
But now we're all Zoom experts. Should we have to be forced to do that, or should we be like out there looking for things, curious? Maybe I add that one to the list, curiosity. You know? So then I just think you have to be a collaborator at heart. And that's difficult for people, because sometimes collaborating can slow you down. Because you now have to talk to this person, you have to talk to that person. And I think there are things you can do in your organization to speed that up. But you have to be willing to actually work with people. There's a willingness that you have to team up to get things done. So those are just some traits, but I think ultimately it's, how do you find a way as a leader to make a person feel like they own part of the organization? They own the organization's success, no matter where they are in the organization. And how do you hire people who are willing to accept that responsibility because they believe in the mission as well? So those are just some things.
Yeah, and Art, I think this all such a great thread right back to the first of your 9 considerations, trust, right? All that stuff you just talked about is possible if we have some intentionality around building trust. And I want to urge everybody too, I put in the chat, but a lot of this, you all have heard me say the people in the process are more important than the product. If you've been to any of my workshops, I believe that. And process is so important in this too, because I think part of the way you build that trust and you're able to draw out of people all of these traits and let them exhibit these traits is to have good processes for them to participate. So I urge you to go back and you look at some of the videos of the workshops that we did on strategic visioning, the assets and liabilities inventory, the miracle exercise, and even processes like the 248 process that helps to draw out the introverts in the crowd, who maybe aren't going to be so forthcoming. But if you do the 248, when you're trying to build consensus, where you start people in groups of 2, and then you have them talk to each other and achieve consensus, and then you attach them to another group of 2, and you have the 4 of them achieve consensus until you build up the whole group, where you ensure participation by everybody. I think those processes are important to collaboration as well. And so I think all of this stuff really fits together nicely. Let me go and see if there's any more. I don't see any other questions in there. The last thing, though, I wanted to, I thought there was a very interesting twist you brought up, Art, on vision. And again, any of these folks who have been to my workshops, they know I talk a lot about vision, right? Yeah. The story of the future. That's what, that's where the magic happens, is in that space between the story of the present and the story of the future. That's where engagement can happen. And I love the way you kind of put a new twist on that in the context of collaboration, in that sometimes collaboration can be scary because you have a fear that you might, you might dilute what it is that you're doing by partnering with other groups.
Right.
But if you don't think about it in the present, and instead you develop this collective vision, it kind of takes some of the risk out of it, and you take some of the fear of damaging current conditions by setting this collaborative vision. I love that concept.
Yeah, well, I think that's how we get people out of that mindset that it's going to be a bad thing if it's a collaboration. You're creating something that doesn't exist. How can it hurt you? It doesn't exist right now.
Right.
And if you are willing to work on it, then there may be roles for you in that future, right? But I'll tell you this too, there's a threat associated with there not being a role for you at all if you don't do these things. I hate to couch things in negatives, but the pressures that are on nonprofits to change and evolve, to meet new needs, is real. And you know, some of the problems that we have had to deal with as organizations were familiar, but I can tell you, look at your own community. Look at Southern California. How many years in a row do you think you're going to be able to have fires like this before there's a whole host of new challenges that come about that need to be addressed? Everything from moving people to reforesting to finding, you know, ways to get kids better educated. All of these things we can't even envision right now. So you better have nimble organizations, I think, made up of people who are, as I would say, visionary, looking down the road, who are always looking for new tools to get things done, who are always looking to solve new problems, and who are willing to work with others to do it. That's how you succeed. I would say right now, there should probably be a collaborative forming somewhere to think about what does Orange County look like 5 years from now once these fires are finally dealt with? Or what does our county look like if we never deal with the fires? If there's a continuing stream of these fires, what does that look like for Southern California? What new needs will there be? Who should be solving those problems? How do we add what we have as an organization to solve that? We should think about, well, what is that going to mean for our organization? What if, 30% of the population exits? What's that going to mean for your economy? So I mean, I don't mean to be doom and gloom. I mean, there are probably some great things too that can happen. But you have to think now because it takes time to create those things. And here's another thing for you, Tim. We can be agents in creating the future. It doesn't just have to be something that happens to us. But I know sometimes as nonprofits, we sometimes feel maybe a bit powerless. What's our little organization going to do to deal with that? You don't necessarily have to be the biggest organization in the world to have impact. But if you just want to work alone, it makes it a lot harder. It's ideas that matter. Ideas that matter. If you have great ideas and you're willing to work with other people who see those ideas, now you got something. Without that, if you just want to come to people and say, well, we want to help these. Last year we helped 5 people, and we want to, we worried about the fire, so we want to make sure we help those 5 people again next year. That's nice, great, wonderful. But wouldn't it be great if you said, we want to help 5 people, but we've also been thinking there've got to be like hundreds of organizations out there that are in the same position that we are, and we need to think about what that means. We need to make sense of this fact and figure out what future do we want to be a part of building in this community. That's the collaboration. That's exciting to people. That is uplifting. That offers hope. Hope is what people want to fund. They don't necessarily want to fund what you did in the past. They want to fund something that you're going to do that is going to make a difference in the lives of people in the future. And you can't convince them that you're relevant just based on what you did before, because what you did before is this compared to the real problem.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's end with these questions, because they're
Okay.
two questions that dovetail with each other here, and really good questions. So you have a collaboration potentially moving forward. How do you approach the money question, which is often the hinge on whether something moves forward? Who gets what? And then following on that, how do you best determine who becomes sort of the fiscal agent of that, dollar, the lead organization once the collaboration is established? How do you have the conversation about dividing up the money pie in a potential collaboration?
Yeah, well, I understand how that's also where the rubber meets the road. But this is also, I think, a test for whether people are entering this thing with the right mindset.
Right.
Because if it falls apart at the point at which we start divvying up money, then we didn't come in with the right orientation.
Yep.
I mean, that's where I'm at. So if all of us aren't willing to say, you take the money and point to each other, then that's a problem. Now, you solve the problem, I think, by saying, who's best in our mix to manage this? Who's best in our mix? And if you're concerned that it might not be, again, divvied out the way it needs to be, you don't have the right people. But you can also build in some controls, right? So you build in like a small committee made up of people from each of the entities to decide how the money gets distributed and when it gets distributed. And you create rules around that. That can be managed. But if going in, it's, they got it and we didn't get it, that's not the right collaboration. Something went wrong there. That's my reaction.
Yeah,
and I also Adriana nodding her head over here.
Yeah, so. I also think that when you're doing collaborative funding proposals, it's essential, again, go back to the grant winning workshop, right? That's a collaborative grant proposal development process, right? It's not a writing project that somebody does individually. So essentially, when I do those processes, I've done a ton of collaborative grants and seeking funding. Those issues are already decided as part of the proposal development process because all the collaborators are involved in that. So when the budget's developed, everybody is involved, and those questions that aren't just, those issues aren't just talked about, that's all discussed beforehand. Again, if you're putting the genie back in the bottle later, you didn't probably set it up at the beginning in a way that was going to be constructive for you down the line. One other question popped up before we go. So it's a question of kind of socialization of this internally, socialization of a collaborative mentality and the skill sets that an organization needs in order to collaborate effectively. Catherine asks, what's your suggestion for the best approach to deliver the message to staff that the organization will need to continue to evolve the skills needed to accomplish and be better collaborators?
I think the first thing you ask your people is, if you were to line up everybody in your organization and ask them this simple question: do you think that the programs we run today are going to be relevant and valid in the way that we do them 10 years from now? If you believe that, stand here. If you believe that they're not going to be relevant and valid, stand here. Or somewhere along the continuum. And let us know. Then what you do is, depending on where people are standing, you ask them, why is it that you're standing where you do? Why are you standing over here believing that nothing's going to affect our program? And I think through that conversation, you start to understand what you have in your organization. No one's wrong here. All you're basically trying to do is get an understanding of where people's heads are as relates to change. Okay. So let's assume that you have an organization where people are feeling very confident about the current programs and that they're not worried about the future at all. As a leader, then you have some work to do to help your people appreciate that things are indeed changing, and that unless we change too, we're not going to be relevant. So that means you can begin to establish messaging around how you communicate with your employees. You're going to start getting them things to read. You're going to be opening up all of your staff meetings with a story about something disruptive that happened in your space. You're going to be pointing out new tools that allow different organizations to do things better. And so you're going to be slowly beginning to get people to a place where they may not see it the way they saw it before. Part of the comfort that people have, and I hate to use the word ignorance, but it sort of comes from a place where they just haven't heard anything that scares them. And I hate to say it, but we all have to be a little scared, especially if we are thinking that what we have now is going to be here with us 10 years from now. So if you're that leader in that organization, then you have to introduce what I call voluntary fear engagement. You have to like maybe game out something. You have to say, all right, we're coming in today, and I did this with my team once. You have to say to them, I want everybody to come in the office 9 this morning, and you have to have a scenario ready for them. I want you to do this. In 6 months, we're going to lose half of our funding. How do we get it back and grow it and not have to lay anybody off? How do we do that? And it's everybody's job to figure that out. You got one day. I guarantee you they will come up with 20 ideas. But you have to really put them in that place. Imagine what this could mean for us if this happens. And at the end of the day, you start collecting. There'll be some similar ideas, some not so similar. Start, gathering the ones that are similar together and see what you got. Some of them you'll want to do right away. And you ask the people who were doing this thing that they love and they didn't worry about, wouldn't it be cool to just do this anyway? It's different than what we're doing now. Maybe you're not worried that it's going to actually be necessary, but wouldn't it be cool to try this? You guys came up with it. Let's try it. So then you begin getting them trying different things. And just like Zoom, boy, colleges and universities, great example. You couldn't convince many professors that you could ever teach anybody anything on Zoom. You have to be in class in order to learn. 6 months ago, I'm throwing out a number, probably 90% of the faculty members at colleges and universities felt that way. We got to have 100 people in the lecture hall or nothing at all. Or we have to have, in a small liberal arts college, we have to have the 10 people in our, highly selective school learning together, in order to achieve something. And they still believe that, but they're doing it on Zoom. They're doing it anyway on Zoom because they had to. What would they be doing if it wasn't for Zoom? I guess we would all have coronavirus because all the schools would be opening. But I'm just saying, look, you have to do things. First, you have to understand what you have in your organization. Once you understand what you have as a leader, then it's your responsibility to move people from where they are. And there's some different things you can do to help orient people to what's really happening in the world. And I think through that orientation, you begin to get a better understanding of how to drive people forward. That's what I'm trying to say. You can begin to change that orientation. Some people won't make it. You have to expect that too. Some people, they're going to decide, this isn't the organization for me. And that's cool. We'll help you, try to find another job if we can. This isn't the organization for you because we have to do things. We see it differently. Others have been waiting for this opportunity that you're giving them to be creative and to use what they're here to do. And understand, younger people, according to studies, are much more collaborative and willing to try new things. They understand stuff that you don't understand. They think differently. I never will forget my son growing up in high school. I'd go up in his room and he'd be playing bug-eye chess, which is this form of chess, I understand. Had the headphones on, listening to music, doing his homework, and chatting with some people at the same time. That's a different mind. There's a concept of that called, what do they call it? I think they call it partial continuous attention. Look that up. It's different than multitasking. In my world, we call something. It's partial continuous attention. You can look that up. It's a thing. It's like their brains are different. So they're used to doing lots of things at once. They're able to manage things differently than we could. This isn't hard for them. They want this. They want to be creative. So put that out.
So we're coming to the end of our time, but I love the concept of voluntary fear engagement. That is, I could see some of your wheels turning already, asking people to clear their calendar for an undisclosed purpose for a single day and gathering them all in the conference room in the morning and submitting to them. Imagine the organizations that had done that maybe a year prior to the pandemic happening, right? Imagine a scenario where we all have to work remotely for, you could, and then by the end of the day, and leave it to them to come up with processes to get to some solutions and ideas and everything, and watch the creativity happen in your team, and also kind of pop the bubble of fear, a little bit for people, because as soon as you engage it, right, you know who your adversary is, and it's not as scary anymore. That's an amazing concept.
Well, I won't take credit for that one. That was my friend Bob Johansson. Look him up. Institute for the Future. He's a terrific man. But it's something that stuck with me. It stuck with me that, wow, we don't have to be afraid of the future if we engage it early, right? If we get there early, then we don't have to be fearful. We can game it out. We can play through scenarios and really maybe do some things that we wouldn't have done and not be in that crisis situation.
Right.
The other thing I'll leave you with too, let me leave you with this. We have to do this, folks, because we can expect that we're going to be dealing with decreasing periods of stability. Decreasing periods of stability. And if you don't have resiliency built into your organization, the ability of people to manage fear or to manage crisis, then you're going to struggle. And so think of it in terms of that. This isn't, I'm not giving you something that I want you to be afraid of. I'm just trying to prepare you. I'm trying to get everyone oriented the right way. You react differently when you expect something, as you said, Tim. It's about managing expectation. We react differently when you expect something than you do when you don't expect it. And what I'm suggesting is that we have to get our teams, our partners, our funders, everyone ready to accept a world in which we have decreasing periods of stability. So don't think you can ever, wow, we did it. Now we can relax. Yeah. Well, you should be able to relax for 10 years. Now you can relax for 10 days before something else happens. And that's a whole different orientation that you have to have. It's not fear, and it's not even exhaustion. It's just we have to adjust to this world. We can't just go out of existence as human beings. We're not going to shut our organizations down. We're just going to understand that we have to do it differently. We have to think differently. We have to have a different constitution in order to manage ourselves and to manage our work. And that means we have to be healthy, both physically and mentally, right? We have to see life as not only just about ourselves, but there's larger purposes. And through that, we can deal with these continuing challenges that are going to be with us again and again and again. But we'll be ready. We will have, I used to be a baseball player, love playing baseball. But boy, the first few weeks playing baseball, my hands would get beat up, from catching the ball and swinging a bat and hitting the ball. You get calluses on your hand. And at first they'd be blisters though, but then they would grow to calluses. And once the calluses came, I never had any trouble hitting the ball, never had any trouble catching the ball. It's the same thing here. If you do something enough, if you see it enough, you know how to deal with it. That's what I'm trying to leave you with. Collaboration is just one of these tools that'll help you.
Great stuff, Art. So let's first give a virtual round of applause to Art for the great insights this morning. Thank you so much, Art. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for attending. Couple of things before we go. One is I put a link in the chat. I hope you will all check it out and bookmark it, and then go work your way through the articles in the Stanford Social Innovation Review series on advancing collaboration. Art has one of the articles in there on these 9 considerations. But the other articles in there are really great too. So I encourage you to do that. And then also, please, I'm going to channel Laura here. Laura, are there any other instructions on the evaluation? We know it's harder. Let me say this. We know it's harder in this virtual environment than when we have you a captive audience live and I tell everybody not to leave before you fill out the evaluations. So please, because we do want to be evidence-based in the work that we do here with the task force. And so those evaluations have helped us do things like put this collaboration workshop together today, because we hear from you what it is that you'd like to see, what's being effective for you, all that kind of stuff. So really appreciate you doing that, filling out the evaluation. And then
I'm putting the link on one more time, Tim, so I just popped it up right now.
Great. And then I will just say thank you to all of you, and certainly to Josh for joining us, Josh Newman for joining us this morning. Sue, any final words before we go?
Tim, can I put in one plug for my new podcast?
Yes.
It's the Heart of Giving podcast.
Yes.
The Heart of Giving. You can find, I put it in the chat, heartgiving.podbean.com, and it's on all of the platforms where you do podcasts. But we're trying to uncover the mystery, I guess, behind why we give and serve through stories of people who have done this, right? Who have given their lives to service, or who are just starting out with this orientation. I really hope you listen, would love your feedback on it. And maybe sometimes some of you might be guests even. So please, I would love to, you would honor me greatly if you would check it out.
And just going back to what Tim was saying, you have actually honored us by joining us on the Zoom. Thank you so much. I've seen the different chats, but I have to tell you, and I echo what Tim had said earlier, the snippets of the planning meeting that we've had, I've always taken away something out of it. And this was just, it was, I think somebody said it was a gem. It's really something. And I'm looking forward to the Heart of Giving podcast. I'm so glad that you shared that with us. Thank you so much. Really, there are no words, but I do ask, can you run for the US president? Like maybe in the near future somewhere? and I'm being very serious.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Thank
I'll
you
tell you,
so
my
much.
wife wouldn't, I don't think, go along with that. And that's a whole other thing, presidency, my goodness. I love
Thank
what
you
I'm
so
doing too much for that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It was good seeing all of you here. Stay safe and be well. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Thank you, Tim, Laura, and Rachel for hosting this platform on Zoom. Thank you so much.
Good
Bye,
luck.
everybody.